He is David Katz, everybody. Come on, put it together for David Katz. What up, David Katz? How are you, sir?
Hi. Great to be with you. Am I coming in audio and video, right?
You are. And
look at you.
All of you who said David wouldn't be able to do it and there'd be an issue, you're all losers.
There you go.
That's right. David hit the ball today.
Why are you yelling?
I'm yelling because I'm excited.
Why are you yelling?
Oh, I love it, David. You look great and you sound great. Now, thank you for being here. I promised everybody some talk about the Supreme Court, so I'm happy to talk about whatever with you always. But I wonder if you could give us a word about this court, which seems to be, listing to one side and has lost so much respect. I mean, you could argue that there was a politicized court always. I've heard that argument made, and I've heard it made soundly by some people. But, the rollback of what was claimed to be settled law and, it seems the clear compromise of certain justices. I'm wondering if you could speak to the court and the notion of both expanding it and also beyond that, what ethical standard might apply, and even term limits. Could that ever be a reasonable scenario for the court?
Well, the Dobbs decision overruling Roe v. Wade was really an earthquake. It was a breaking of precedent, and because it was such a well-established precedent, I think that really amazed people, and I think it made them really take heed of the fact that they have to really watch what the Supreme Court does and who's on the Supreme Court and the composition and the number of justices on the Supreme Court, because those are very important issues which are actually up to the people. And not only do we have that really unprecedented, remarkable case, that reversal in Dobbs, but we also had Citizens United, a 5-4 decision, which was really strange itself. That made sort of this unlimited dark money the constitutional right under free speech of all these corporations. Who knew corporations even had free speech? They're not people.
No, but essentially the court said they are people, right, David? I mean, that was the decision.
Yes, and that they had these sort of untrammeled free speech rights that meant that they could contribute any amount of money that they wanted to. We just had a fellow, he lost down here, Caruso. He spent over $100 million of his own money to be mayor. That was his free speech. And at least you know who it's coming from. It was coming from Caruso. But a lot of this dark money, Mark, you don't even know who it's coming from because the disclosure laws never really caught up with the fact of what they did in Citizens United. So, of course, that was hugely controversial. Then Hobby Lobby sort of followed it. That's the one that's become controversial with Alito right now. We can address that in a minute if you'd like to. But sure. The Hobby Lobby one, now these corporations not only have First Amendment rights to speak, but they seem to have First Amendment rights to have a religion. Did I mention it's a corporation? And yet it's allowed to deny contraception. It's allowed to deny birth control advice because...
Again, just to remind people, that's what Hobby Lobby was going to court to do. They were saying, look, we don't want to pay for those things you're talking about, for contraception, these things that had to do with birth control because we don't believe in it. And it's our religious right to deny it to those employees.
But to have a corporation or an organization given privileges by the state, and yet it takes that tack, and the Supreme Court agrees with it 5-4. So both Citizens United and Hobby Lobby were 5-4 extreme decisions. On top of that, you have Heller, the gun control. Now, somehow, when the Second Amendment, the vaunted Second Amendment by the right wing, when it says the right of the people to be secure, the armed militia is connected very much with the right of the people to be secure. And so it was very clear to the courts for over 150 years that the Second Amendment only meant that you couldn't restrict the right to have firearms in a militia. These folks aren't a militia. A militia is state regulated, state approved. You can't form a militia by calling yourself the militia or calling yourself the Oath Keepers. And yet this has become another huge issue. So you add all of those together, and the voting rights in the South, that was the case where they said, you know what, we don't really need to have this Voting Rights Act have pre-clearance before people are vote in the South. That was the famous Shelby County case. So you add all those together, and that's one of the reasons they said, well, the South has gotten past that. There won't be problems with making them wait in long, making minorities, African Americans wait in long lines. There won't be the problems that we've seen like with the old poll taxes. everything looks like it's hunky-dory in the South, the Supreme Court said, what does the Supreme Court, a bunch of lawyers, know about the political conditions or the voting conditions? But they stepped into that. So you add all that together. You had Shelby County, the voting rights. You have the Citizens United. You have the gun case, which is getting expanded, just got expanded this last term by New York Pistol Society. And then you finally have this Dobbs and Roe v. Wade. People really are at their wits' end what to do about this hyper-activist right-wing Supreme Court. So my suggestion, used to talk about this with Pat Thurston all the time. We talked about this when Breyer announced his resignation. I think we talked about it way back during Kavanaugh, was that the Constitution does not set, Mark, any number of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. It hasn't always been 9. It started out being 5 or 6. Lincoln expanded it to 10. The Republic had other problems. We had a civil war at the time, but we had no problems on the fact that it went to 10 justices. Then one of them passed away, and they said, you know what? It'll be just fine with 9. The people who say it has to always be odd because otherwise they can never break ties, that's not necessarily true either. If they can't break a tie, then whatever the lower courts decided remains the law.
Sure, the court is deadlocked on something. What's the big deal? Right.
Yeah, Lincoln did very well with 10 justices. But of course, it got a bad name adding more justices to the U.S. Supreme Court on account of FDR. FDR had a really harebrained scheme to pack the court. He had a Senate ally, and the Senate ally was going to be one of the new justices. And so he pushed the bill because he wanted to go out of the Senate, where he had to face re-election, and have life tenure and the honor of being on the U.S. Supreme Court. So with all of it, as popular as FDR was, this court packing got a bad name. As I said, it was a rather harebrained scheme where justices had to retire at a certain age, and then new ones came in, and they sort of sat together for a while. It was complicated. This one that I proposed, that many people have proposed, is very, very simple. You'd go from 9 to 11. The elegant part of 11 that might actually get some votes is that we'd be right back to where Chief Justice Roberts would break the ties. In other words, it would be a 5-5 court. There'd be 2 more moderates or liberals on it, and there'd be 5 with one view, 5 with another view, and Chief Justice Roberts would break the tie. Of course, the 13 would give the Democrats an out-and-out majority. They would presumably be moderate or to liberal Democrats. They would vote with the 3 Democrats who are moderates to liberals on there right now, and you would have, with 13, you'd really have a 7-6 Democratic majority, which I'm not sure in my lifetime we've had a Democratic majority on the Supreme Court. I think maybe during LBJ for a brief period of time. But, you know, Chief Justice Warren, who was a wonderful Chief Justice, he also went to Berkeley like I did. Have to plug Berkeley's law school. He was a wonderful justice. People forget he was a Republican. Brennan was a Republican. Souter was a Republican. Stevens was a Republican. We haven't always had this thing where, well, as soon as you know they're a Republican, you know that they're going to vote for things like Dobbs. They're going to vote for things like Citizens United. Stevens and Souter were very balanced. But we're not in that era anymore, Mark, which is why I took the time to go over some of the decisions that have really animated people who think there's been a radical change in the law under this crew that's in there right now. Now, people say, Mark, that if you went to 13, as soon as the Republicans got power, when they had the Senate and the presidency and the House, you'd have to have all 3, which the Democrats have or have for another month. That was why I thought this was more feasible, although you never would have gotten, this would have had to break the filibuster. Manchin and Sinema never would have broken the filibuster.
Let's go back to, so in other words, in order to pull this off, you would have had to do what, David? You're essentially saying the chess pieces were not in place. Go ahead. Yeah.
Right. The Democrats had a majority in both houses. They still do for another month in the House. And so it's simple legislation. You pass a bill which says, previously we had a law that says that I guess the last time they passed legislation actually was when Lincoln put the 10th justice on the Supreme Court. That had to go through the Congress. Of course, the Congress was all Republican like he was then, because we had a civil war. The Democrats had mainly seceded, their states had. So it went to 10. Then I think there was legislation when it went back to 9, and there's nothing since then. So they would pass new legislation that there was 11 or 13. If it passed the House, it could pass by 1 vote. In the Senate, it could pass on a tie vote, except that Manchin and Sinema, for any kind of major legislation, will not allow majority rules. They won't allow getting rid of the filibuster. So they definitely would have filibustered this bill. So the reality was it would not have gotten through the Senate. Now it probably can't be enacted because the House won't even pass it in the first instance once it becomes Republican. But I think it's a good idea. I think it's one to bear in mind in 2 years. I think it's likely that the Democrats get the House back, keep the Senate. Biden or some Democrat gets reelected. And I think it's a serious thing because people have to ask themselves, especially younger people, do they want to live for the next 20 or 30 years being ordered about by this crew with black robes on the U.S. Supreme Court? It's become that politicized. That's what the polls show, that people view them as just another bunch of politicians, this crowd with black robes on. And there has been this diminution of respect for the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think that my proposal would actually restore respect for the Supreme Court, especially something like just 2 justices, just going to 11. My last point was that people say if the Republicans ever got full power back, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. They would make it 15, and put 2 Republicans on there. But again, what's the alternative? To live with this 9, to live with the 6-3 Republican supermajority? And it's Chief Justice Roberts isn't the savior on all these cases. He didn't vote with, he would have done less. He would have had the 15 or 16 weeks, whatever it was, say that was the law. He wouldn't have overruled Roe v. Wade. But he was gung-ho. He was the 5th vote on Citizens United. He was the 5th vote on a lot of things. So these people who are waiting for Chief Justice Roberts. But what I'm saying is it would be more palatable, Mark, I think, to people. Now let's turn to term limits. Can we talk about that?
I just want to, yeah, absolutely. And I want to just note diminution is a ding word, please. Yeah, thank you very much. You really stated it right. But before we move on to term limits, I just want to, one more little round off this point you're making. Because you're helping me. I thought that you needed congressional approval the way you were suggesting. But then I believe it was David K. Johnston, who we have on, who's going to join us again next week, who was making the point that the president can literally expand the court on his own. Is that not right? On his or her own? I know, but you're saying it takes congressional approval. Go ahead.
He or she could make a recess appointment. So some of the people, after Scalia passed away, and there were 8, there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court. They could have put Merrick Garland on the court. Obama could have put Merrick Garland on the court as a recess appointment, and he would have served until the end of the year. I think that Merrick Garland and Obama both saw that would seem like trying to push their way into something that they were going to get without pushing their way. They really believed, I think both of them, that some senators would be brought around. I mean, all the people who never agreed to have Merrick Garland's name come up, they included Murkowski, they included Collins, they included Romney. If those 3 had gotten together and said, no, this is a really good candidate, fair is fair. Scalia died almost a year before the election. We do not leave the Supreme Court with only 8 members for a year before the election. That's not what precedent shows that we ought to do. And so let's bring Merrick Garland's name up and let's have an up or down vote. He either gets 51 votes or he doesn't. Those 3 were not willing to do that. So McConnell was able to never put the nomination up before the Senate. And I think that Mr. Johnson's point was that Obama could have made a recess appointment and it would have been sort of a fait accompli that he was there. But the Republicans could have said, we don't like your fait accompli and we don't like you, Garland. So you know what? He just thought that it would. I think that Obama and I think Garland also thought it would antagonize the Senate, which could be persuaded. But you see, McConnell was not persuadable.
They thought it would be playing a little too dirty and aggressive, and then it turned out the Congress itself, McConnell and others, were playing even dirtier and more aggressive.
Except the way it turned out, assuming that Trump had won, that would have been the end of Merrick Garland's time on there. You can't stay on. So his recess appointment would have ended. He would have been off the Supreme Court. And I think after that, he would never have been approved as I think there were a few who voted. There were quite a few who voted for him, Republicans, as Attorney General. No life tenure, not one of the 9 on the Supreme Court. But I don't think he would have gotten any of their votes. He would have been perceived as having, as you say, kind of put his big foot in there when he should have gone through the confirmation process and been confirmed and gotten on there. So the president cannot expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court, not by even 1 justice, but he could have replaced a deceased justice, at least for some period of time.
Now, on to what you were talking about, which is term limits. Go ahead.
Well, here's why I don't like term limits. First of all, it wouldn't apply to anyone who's on there right now. So Alito may live to be 90. Okay. So it'll never term him out. He'll be on there till he's 90. The other ones who live, Kavanaugh and what's his name? Kavanaugh, I always forget his name. Gorsuch. They may live to be 95. It won't term them out. Meanwhile, who's going to be appointed next? Probably a Democrat. Okay. Or maybe somebody moderate by the Republicans. They'll have, let's say, a 15-year term. So I don't see where that addresses the problem of this radical right-wing Supreme Court supermajority that's either 5-4 or 6-3. It seems on every case that we have right now. And the other thing with term limits is it will create, I think, an unseemly situation. Let's say it's a 15-year term where the person then goes on to be like a Supreme Court advocate after they've been a Supreme Court justice. We have that in the law all the time. I'm a federal criminal defense attorney after having been an assistant U.S. attorney. You can say, well, if that's good enough for you, that's good enough for you, Mr. Katz. Why isn't that good enough for the person who has a 15-year term on the Supreme Court and then they're a Supreme Court advocate? I don't know. I don't think that's when you see, why are we going to go to that system? Why are we going to go through all of that of having term limits? And I believe that one, you do have to amend the Constitution, because I think on term limits, it says right in the Constitution that the justices will serve during good behavior.
And so you know you're not going to get it through Congress. You
have to. I think you have to do a constitutional amendment, Mark. I don't think getting it through Congress is enough for term limits.
Well, I know constitutional amendments is certainly beyond the pale, right? I mean, that's a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me just move on to Alito and Alito. I say Alito to Alito for a moment, and the violation of ethical standards. Can you just give us a quick summary of that in our last few minutes? Explain why this investigation started, or why this, there was this. Well, it was an investigation, essentially. The legal counsel, looked at things and made a judgment and a statement that Alito didn't make any ethical violation. I wonder if you could speak to that real quick.
Sure. Soon after he was appointed, I had a chance to meet Justice Alito socially. A delightful person. He did not give me any heads up on any U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And I honestly don't think, although I disagree with him politically and philosophically and what he's done on the U.S. Supreme Court, I just don't believe that there's evidence that backs this up. When I think there is evidence behind something, Mark, I say so. When I don't think there is, from what I've seen so far, I say so. But the allegation...
And just take a moment, David, to explain. There was an allegation that essentially the judgment that was going to be handed down by the high court was tipped ahead of time.
Right. And so when we had all of this commotion over the leaking of the draft of the Alito decision in Dobbs, I guess he's a preacher, a minister. Right. At that time, he was very pro-life. He was involved in all of that, and he had some rich friends, and his rich friends had given a bunch of money to the Supreme Court Historical Association, and they had a dinner with the Alitos socially. Supposedly, at that dinner, this decision was leaked, and he was told about it. Those two deny. One of them is dead. The woman in the couple, denies that this happened. But the minister says that the decision, how it was going to come out, the outcome was leaked to him, that he knew it was going to be by Alito, and it was going to be 5-4 to affirm Hobby Lobby's supposed constitutional right to not give contraception or abortion services as advice to their employees because they were a religious organization or religious corporation or whatever, and therefore they didn't have to comply with this part of Obamacare. But the only person who says that this happened, in my opinion, from what I've seen so far, is this minister. And this minister has now sort of reinvented himself as a progressive minister. And so you can say, Mark, that he does have sort of a motive to make Alito look bad, to generate this storm of controversy. And on top of that, the New York Times said that there are emails which supposedly back up that he had some prior knowledge, but I didn't see them in the New York Times story that I read, and I looked very carefully for them. So I think without proof that happened, by the way, Alito has denied it. He denied that he leaked anything, that his wife had leaked anything. He did admit that he had this social dinner with these rich right-wing Republicans who'd given a bunch of money to this Supreme Court Historical Association, it's called. And so I think that particular one, I don't think is really going to go anywhere. Like I said, I think that the solution to these problems is really to have 11 or 13 justices on the Supreme Court. And let me emphasize this again. It's a mere act of Congress. We don't need to amend the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't call out 9 members. It doesn't call out 6 members. We could change this by legislation. A few more senators. Everyone should go out and vote next week down in Georgia for Warnock, in my opinion. I hope I'm not politicizing or editorializing too much.
You're allowed. You're allowed. I mean, you don't want to.
Herschel Walker. I am not for Herschel Walker. You could.
A werewolf can kill a vampire. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Can I ask Mr. Katz a question about Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife Ginny? They haven't been charged with anything. There's no crime alleged, but a lot of people have been calling for them to meet some type of consequence for basically conduct unbecoming a Supreme Court justice. What are your thoughts? Is anything on the horizon for how that might be dealt with?
Well, they may, as to the wife, Kim, she may be involved in some criminality with those alternate slates. She called down to Arizona. January 6th committee was looking into that. I think the Department of Justice now is looking into that. Remember, that case went up to the Supreme Court. They were trying to quash the subpoena that had been issued to that Arizona official. That Arizona official was in contact with Ginny Thomas. Ginny Thomas also had some relationship with this Oath Keepers fellow. Pat used to call him the Yahoo. I called him the Yale Who. He's the one who remarkably went to Yale Law School, which is, Thomas's school. There's a lot of people who, were on the Oath Keepers that you wonder why on earth that was this former U.S. Supreme Court clerk. This former Yale law graduate. Why was he involved in this right-wing insurrection? And why on earth would Ginny Thomas have been in any sort of contact with him or with these other insurrectionists? She was forwarding emails that were really inflammatory, tweets that were inflammatory. So she may have her own consequences. But at the end of the day, I don't think Clarence Thomas is going to have any legal consequences because there's no group that has the authority to really review the ethics of the U.S. Supreme Court. People think Chief Justice Roberts could do it. No, he has no authority to tell the other justices what to do. He's an administrative chief. He's not a chief in terms of power to tell them what to do. So, Kim, unfortunately, while I'm very offended that he gets himself in these cases where he obviously should recuse himself, I really don't see what else they can do. They could investigate him in the Senate. The Senate will still be Democratic. And the Democrats in the Senate could certainly investigate this. They could subpoena people. There's no reason why they couldn't subpoena a U.S. Supreme Court justice like Clarence Thomas. But what goes around comes around. How fast do you think that there'll be a House subpoena after that to one of the liberal or moderate U.S. Supreme Court justices? And they've shown already, McCarthy and his crowd, that they love playing payback. They're going to keeping Marjorie Taylor Greene, for keeping her off committees after she just about threatened Pelosi's life and made these crazy remarks about there being a Jewish space beam or something like that out in the heavens. Now they're going to retaliate by not letting Adam Schiff, a distinguished legislator, serve on any committees. I mean, so at some point, the payback, you can't worry about the payback, but I think with the Clarence Thomas subpoenaing him to the Senate, I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. So I'm sorry, Kim, because I wish there was some remedy in the law.
You are seeing this sort of being compromised in plain sight in a way that, at least in my lifetime, I've never seen it. I think that there was always, as I say, a political agenda. Many of these appointments, maybe all of these appointments, are driven by some sort of agenda, and maybe some of the agendas are lofty, but this degree, as you suggest, of collusion about in terms of participating in a coup and a power grab and overturning an election, it just seems beyond the pale, and yet it's where we are. All right, now I see we got to wrap up. Look, it's a real luxury to have you here, David Katz. Congratulations on joining us without any technical issues. Whatever you did this week, David, do it again next week. This is terrific. I was betting on you.
It was great being with you. And Kim, it's nice to hear your voice. You were on with Pat and me for how many years now?
A long time.
And to the show.
Yeah, but this time we get to see you in your nice, crisp shirt and tie.
Oh, listen to
Even
that.
better.
Yeah.
We're moving on up.
It's pretty great. Pretty good, David.
There's never been anything like this.
That's right. There never has been anything like it. All right. David Katz, everybody. Thanks, David.
Yeah.